Peter Unger serves as Distinguished Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Environmental Dynamics PhD program at the University of Arkansas. He received his PhD in Anthropological Sciences from Stony Brook University and taught gross anatomy in the medical schools at Johns Hopkins and Duke before joining the University of Arkansas in 1995. He's an honorary professorial research fellow of the Evolutionary Studies Institute at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, and he has served as visiting faculty at Flinders University in Adelaide, Australia, the University of Helsinki in Finland, and Southwest Jiaotong University in Chengdu, China. He's also a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Johns Hopkins Society of Scholars. Professor Unger is known primarily for his work reconstructing diet and environments from fossil teeth. He spent thousands of hours observing wild apes and other primates in the forests of Latin America and Indonesia, studied fossils from Tyrannosaurids to Neanderthals, and has developed new techniques for using surface analysis technologies to tease information about ecology and evolution from tooth shape and patterns of use wear. He's also conducted research on oral health of the Hadza peoples of Tanzania, the last remaining hunter-gatherers in Africa. Professor Unger has written or co-authored more than 200 scientific works on ecology and evolution for journals, books, and other media, including Science, Nature, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Scientific American, and Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. These are focused on teeth, food choices, and feeding and living primates, and the role of diet and environmental change in the evolution of human ancestors and other fossil species. He's also edited or co-edited 3 volumes focusing on ecology and evolution. And his academic book, Mammal Teeth, Origin, Evolution, and Diversity, won the Prose Award from the Association of American Publishers for Best Book in the Biological Sciences. His recent popular science titles, Teeth, A Very Short Introduction, Oxford University Press, and Evolution's Bite, Princeton University Press, are available in bookstore shelves and online. Dr. Unger's work has been featured in recent TED-Ed video and documentaries on the Discovery Channel, the Science Channel, BBC Television, and others. He's given dozens of invited talks and keynote addresses at venues around the world, including the Royal Society and Royal Institution in London, the World Health Summit in Berlin, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and the American Museum of Natural History in New York. I began a project with Dr. Unger last fall in the Navigating the New Arctic. It's a Track 2 project, and so I've gotten to know Dr. Unger fairly well over the last 9 months, and welcome him and look forward to his talk.
Thanks for that kind introduction, John. I hope everybody's having a good day, and I will just start sharing the screen. Hope everybody can see that. Are we good? Perfect. Well, again, thank you so much for that kind introduction, John. What I'd like to speak about this afternoon is some of the research that my colleagues and I have done on diet and human evolution. And the title of the talk is Evolution's Bite, Reconstructing Diet and Human Evolution. Of course, it's all about teeth, right? There's something special about them, whether we see them in natural history books or in museums. They call to us, right? I mean, we're grabbed by them. There's reaction we get is visceral. We're drawn to them. Perhaps it has something to do with the fact that we spent most of our evolutionary history running away from teeth. But for whatever reason, teeth are important to us. Just how important? Well, in a survey by the online dating service Match.com, teeth were ranked the single most important attribute in a prospective date, and that's by both men and women, and that's 5,500 singles. So from an evolutionary perspective, we can see that teeth are indeed quite important. Also, just think about them, right? You have to chew. You have to break with your teeth, without those teeth being broken, up to millions of times over the course of your lifetime. And you have to do that with raw materials built from the very same materials as those teeth, right? The foods you eat have the same raw materials as the teeth themselves. They are an incredible feat of engineering. And they teach us what an inspiring engineer nature can be. To me, teeth are important because of what they can teach us about evolution, right? Just think of the myriad types of mammalian molars, thousands of species of mammals, each with a type of tooth that's seemingly perfectly adapted to whatever food that particular species has evolved to eat. Whether we're looking at an antelope with flat teeth, with long parallel blades of enamel for grinding tough grasses, or we're looking at a lion with sharp bladed teeth called carnassials for shearing and slicing tough meat, or looking at a hyena with flat, blunt, thickly enameled teeth for crushing hard food such as bone. Teeth can teach us something about the place of an animal in nature, and that's, again, why they're important to me. But what about us? What about our ancestors? What can our teeth and their teeth tell us about ourselves and our own place in nature? That's the topic of this presentation. We'll begin with a discussion of how teeth work, looking at tooth shape and diet. We'll move on to how teeth are used and take an ecological approach. And while it may seem like semantics, there's a huge difference between these two, how teeth work and how they're used. We'll then look at what I call food prints, which is a way of looking at teeth using microscopic wear. We'll assemble all the evidence and consider the diets of our early ancestors. And finally, if there's time, we'll talk about some of the lessons we have to learn, potentially, for today, in terms of what this evidence can teach us. All right, well, let's just jump into it. Talking about teeth as guides for chewing. That's the first when we're talking about how teeth work. This is the early model. This is sort of the traditional view. Karen Hiemi, I think, said it best. She argued that teeth are an essentially passive element in the active masticatory apparatus and are dependent on the movements of the mandible for their functional interactions. In other words, teeth are basically just passive players in the active game of chewing. So, for example, if you look at a sheep tooth or a rodent tooth, they're basically flat and they've got parallel ridges of enamel. And the system is designed so that movement occurs perpendicular to the long axis of those ridges for milling tough vegetation. If you are a lion and you've got these bladed carnassial teeth, the axis is vertical. It's shearing and slicing. And that, again, is designed. Think of a set of scissors or a pair of shears and how those work. Finally, if you are a bear or a pig or a person, you've got this hammer and anvil type configuration or a mortar and pestle type configuration where you've got these cusps that fit neatly into basins with vertical movements designed for crushing and grinding. So in this sense, again, teeth are basically guides for chewing. But there's another newer model that sees teeth as tools for fracturing. And a sort of dental biomechanist named Peter Lucas, I think, said this best. We can best explain dental dietary adaptations by identifying different forms of food, generalizing about their behaviors under stress, and designing equipment that might operate efficiently to commute them. In other words, if you're thinking about how teeth work, it's best to reverse engineer. It's best to start with foods. Now, foods come from animals and plants that don't want to be eaten, right? And these animals and plants protect themselves, either by hardening their tissues or by toughening their tissues to avoid being broken or cracked. Hardness, in this sense, is the work required to start a crack, whereas toughness is the work required to spread a crack. Foods are rarely both hard and tough. They're typically one or the other. And the challenge that teeth face is breaking foods, starting and spreading a crack. Now, if you start to think about it for a minute, teeth are really counterintuitive in the way they work, right? Because if your goal is to start or spread a crack, what do you want to do? You don't want to compress that crack. That'll keep it from spreading. You need tension to pull that crack apart. How can teeth solve the problem of creating tension through compression? The answer to that question depends on the kind of food that is being broken. If it's a hard food like a walnut, it happens one way, right? So basically, if you want to break a walnut, you crush it, and because the shell is so brittle, it flexes and cracks perpendicular to the long axis of the plane of crushing, right? And in this case, the best tooth, in theory, is a hemispherical cusp-like tooth. Because what that'll do is it'll minimize the contact area with the food, and minimizing contact area is important because stress is force per unit area, and you want to minimize the area to maximize the stress. In addition, you want it to be hemispherical to protect the tooth itself from cracking and breaking. But what about tough foods? Again, tough foods are foods where it's difficult to actually spread a crack. In this case, you want a wedge-like configuration, right? You want to push a wedge in. Think of an axe splitting a log. You want to push that wedge in, and that creates tension at the point of the advancing tip. And that can be continually pushed in to push this crack straight through. And the best tool in this case is going to be a wedge or a set of crests or loafs. And it's even better if they're reciprocal, if they work from both directions at the same time or from opposite directions at the same time so that the crack can be spread from both ways. So this is sort of the basic theory about how teeth should work. Let's go to the real world and see how it actually plays out. We've got 3 species of monkey here. They're all fairly closely related to Old World monkey. This is a silvery langur, a leaf eater, at the bottom. At the top, we have a mangabey monkey that eats a lot of nuts. And in the middle, a soft fruit-eating macaque monkey. And when you look at the teeth, you can see immediately that there are definite but subtle differences in the shapes of these teeth, right? The leaf eater has longer shearing crests or blades than the hard object feeder that has blunter cusps with thicker enamel. The soft fruit eater is in the middle. And so based on the properties of the foods, the shapes of these teeth seem to make sense. And we should be able to use tooth shape in that sense to reconstruct the diet of, say, a fossil primate based on the shape of its teeth. But to do that, we need to have a good way of measuring those teeth to compare. The traditional way of doing this is something called shearing quotient analysis. What you do is you measure the lengths of the crests running front to back on the tooth relative to the length of the tooth itself, so that the relatively longer the crests, the sharper the teeth, the greater the shear potential. Makes intuitive sense. And when you plot a whole bunch of closely related primates with a given diet, in this case, fruit-eating Old World monkeys, you plot shearing crest length over molar length, you see a fairly tight line that gives you the expected length of crests for an Old World monkey that prefers to eat fruits. Well, that's not all that exciting. Well, I guess it is to some people. But what is really exciting is what happens when you put other closely related primates with different diets on this graph. Here are leaf eaters. As you can see, leaf eaters uniformly have longer shearing crests than expected of a fruit eater. And that makes intuitive sense. So if you want to know what a fossil primate ate, all you really need to do is take a graph like this, throw the points for one tooth of that fossil primate on the graph, and it can tell you something, in principle at least, about the dietary adaptation of that primate. All right, well, that's all well and good, but there are real limitations to these conventional shearing quotient analyses, right? First of all, teeth wear down. And when they wear down, the landmarks that we use to measure crest length disappear. Or at least are a moving target. And that makes it really difficult to come up with a comparable measure of functionality of the tooth based on the lengths of the crests. Also, teeth are really complicated structures. And if we're limiting our measurement to crest length, we're probably losing a lot of valuable information about diet. And so as a result of these limitations, my lab, my students and I came up with a new way of measuring the functional aspects of tooth form in non-human primates. We called it dental topographic analysis. It's based on GIS, or Geographic Information Systems. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with GIS, probably most of you, since this is a biology colloquium. But GIS is basically a way of relating different data sets to one another, connecting them by location in space. The classic study is, say a farmer wants to know where to plant his or her crops. That farmer might take a layer of information on soil type, on hydrology, water, on topography, on various different elements, superimpose these layers on top of one another, look for the right combination of traits, and that'll tell them where to plant the crops. But one thing that GIS is really good for is plotting out landscapes and giving you unique measures for characterizing those landscapes. And I figured we could use those on teeth. So I got myself a laser scanner and did just that. I plotted teeth as landscapes. The mountains or cusps became mountains. The fissures became valleys. And we could use all the tools available in GIS to take measurements that could be functionally important. So, for example, we could look at the average slope of the surface of a tooth. We could look at the angularity, which is basically the slope of the slope, the second derivative of elevation, the jaggedness, if you will. We could look at the relief, the relationship between three-dimensional area and two-dimensional area of the tooth. And these can all tell us something about diet. In fact, since my group developed these, other labs have come in and developed even more sophisticated measures, like what's called orientation patch count, the number of patches of area on the tooth that are contiguous and share an orientation. Others have looked at Dirichlet normal energy, which is a measure of the curvature of the surface. And all of these can be taken together to give an idea of the functional aspects of that tooth. So here's sort of the initial study that I did. Basically, what we've got here is slope in the upper graph, relief in the lower graph. Here are specimens at 3 stages of wear: unworn, moderately worn, heavily worn. In green, we have gorillas. Orange, we have orangutans. Red, we've got chimpanzees. Gorillas eat more leaves. Chimps eat more fruit. Orangs are in the middle. And we can see immediately 3 things from these graphs. First, teeth get flatter as they wear down, independent of the species. It's not rocket science, and it makes intuitive sense. But second, leaf eaters have more sloping surfaces with more relief than fruit eaters, and those with mixed diets are in between. Third, the relationships between slope or relief and diet hold at different stages of wear. So as long as you can control for wear, you should be able to say something about the diet of a fossil primate like this. Now, I became really interested in how the function of a tooth changes with wear over time. And so, working with some colleagues at Duke University, went down to Costa Rica over the course of about 10 years, go down twice a year, and repeatedly dart the same howling monkeys and take impressions of their teeth. Not very smart animals. They don't seem to mind very much if you dart them. But you get in there with the same dental impression material that your dentist uses. And you take impressions and make replicas of teeth. And so you can actually look at wild animals and how their teeth change over time with wear. So for example, as you increase the number of years between observations, the change in slope increases. Again, this makes perfect sense, and it's the same for relief. Teeth get flatter as they wear down. But there are some aspects of tooth form that don't seem to change with wear. Jaggedness, remember the second derivative of elevation, angularity? The jaggedness of the surface of the tooth doesn't change with wear at all. So that was really interesting. Here's a sort of the largest study I did, I think completed in 2018. This is a dozen species of sympatric platyrrhines, that is, New World monkeys that live together in the forests of Pará State in Brazil. And they include such things as the fruit-eating squirrel monkey, gum-feeding marmoset, leaf-eating howling monkey, hard object-feeding capuchin monkey. And took about 350 individuals and actually generated dental topographic data for each of these. Here we've got that orientation patch count thing against angularity, which are both two measures fairly robust to wear. And we can see that there are some clear separations of individuals by diet. For example, the leaf eaters and the gum feeders are clearly separable from each other and from the seed predators. But what's really kind of unfortunate is that the fruit eaters span the entire spectrum, pretty much, of values. But at least in some cases, you can distinguish animals on the basis of primary diet. What's exciting to me, though, is when you look just at the fruit eaters and compare them by what their secondary diets are, what the second most common food element is, they separate cleanly. So hard object feeders are clearly separated from seed predators, leaf eaters, and insect feeders. So yes, tooth shape can give us important information about diet. But is it really that simple? Was it Dobzhansky who said nothing in biology is simple? Relationships between anatomy and behavior are complex, and they depend on the situation. Seems that biological structures are often overbuilt for day-to-day functioning. The example I like to give is your car. Your car may be capable of going 100 miles an hour, but that doesn't mean you're going to be driving that way downtown at 5 p.m. That said, the power can be useful for those few times you have to accelerate to get on the highway. Put in another way, you can eat Jell-O 360 days a year. If you have to eat rocks 5 days a year or you'll starve to death, your teeth had better be designed for breaking rocks. So this is just a caveat, something to bear in mind as we move forward. But let's take a look at what actually happens in the wild. Not how teeth work, but how they're really used. Let's go to the forest. The default model is species-specific dietary adaptations. And that model suggests that primates will eat specific food types even when they live in different habitats because the shapes of their teeth and the anatomy of their guts tell them that that's what they should eat. You got sharp teeth, you're going to eat leaves or meat. And that seems to work in a lot of cases. So if you look at these ring-tailed lemurs in more open and closed settings, they're going to eat fruit. If you look at these howling monkeys in more open and closed settings, in different forests, they're going to eat leaves. Vervet monkeys in more open and closed settings are going to eat the same types of foods. Even if the same species of plant isn't available, they're going to seek out foods with similar properties, which is great news for paleontologists who don't know exactly what species of plants, or animals for that matter, are available at a given place, at a given time. But it's not always that simple. Primate adaptations can be complex, and the differences can be fairly subtle. And here's an example from some of my early research at the site of Katambe in Sumatra, where there are 7 species of non-human primates, all with different shaped teeth, different shaped jaws, living in the same patch of forest with access to the same resources. And what I was interested in knowing was, how do they divvy up that forest? And can we use their teeth to understand that, to understand how they divide the niche, if you will, the niches? Now, it's a great natural experiment. I studied 4 of these species, macaques, leaf monkeys, gibbons, and orangutans, for 14 months, tromping through the rainforest. My favorite example is this fruit called Metamodifolium, which is it's kind of somewhere between the size of a golf ball and a tennis ball. and it has the unusual property of hardening as it ripens. You will see the macaques and leaf monkeys and gibbons go up to the liana, the vine that bears these fruits, bite into them, and at first they'll get through them fine, but eventually they won't be able to break through them, and they'll just drop these fruits uneaten. You can even see the tooth bite marks on the fruits themselves when they hit the forest floor. But the orangutans will continue to eat these fruits for weeks after the other species are forced to abandon them, because the great apes have stronger, thicker teeth and more powerful jaws than the other primates. So in this case, we have species with very different jaws and teeth, but an overlap in diet to the point of the same species of fruit, but subtle differences due to adaptive morphology. Next example, the mountain gorilla. This is a lot of people's favorite. Mountain gorillas have these sharp shearing blades, well suited, as I've said, for slicing and shearing leaves. Some mountain gorillas, the ones that live at lower altitudes, are what we call seasonal fallback feeders. They prefer soft fruits like most other primates do, and they'll eat them most of the year, except when fruits aren't available. Then they'll shift to tough leaves and stems during these periods of seasonal stress when their favorite foods are not available. Why? Because their teeth allow them to. They wouldn't eat it if they didn't have to, but there you go. We compare these to higher altitude gorillas, like Dian Fossey's gorillas and the Virungas. They have been forced into upper elevation ranges by human encroachment. You see, the Virunga Mountains are about the most, it's the highest density of people on the African continent outside of urban settings. And it's because these are really fertile lands, the volcanic region. People have settled the lands around the base of the volcano where gorillas used to live, and they've pushed them up into these high altitude areas where no self-respecting ape would ever want to live if it didn't have to. And so they're forced to eat lower quality tough foods because there's no soft fruits available for them to eat at all. How can they do it? Because their anatomy allows them to do it. So same species, same adaptive specializations, but different diets because they live in different environments. Final example, the mangabes. These are monkeys that have thick, flat teeth and strong jaws for crushing hard foods. A couple of species, we'll start with the sooty mangabes of the Thai forest and the Ivory Coast. They live with a dozen other species of primate, and they avoid competition by specializing and consuming year-round Saccharomyces nuts. Now, Saccharomyces nuts are rot-resistant nuts that are kind of like peach pits. And their teeth allow them to break into these peach pit-like nuts, whereas none of the other primates can eat them. And they actually prefer them, so they use this adaptation all the time. These contrast with the gray cheek mangabes, which have the same teeth and jaws, but prefer soft, fleshy fruits, like the sort of wimpier toothed redtail monkeys that live alongside them in the Kabale forest of Uganda. People have studied them for decades and shown that these monkeys only eat hard foods during extreme drought periods that come with El Nino events, once every 7 years or so. The redtails are in trouble. Many of them die. But these guys seem to do fine on bark and hard nuts because their teeth allow them to. So these monkeys are closely related, have similar teeth and jaws, live in similar environments, but have very different food preferences. Okay, then. Well, this brings up the concept of what I like to call the biospheric buffet, right? I envision the biosphere, which is that part of our planet that harbors life, as a kind of giant buffet table. Animals belly up to that sneeze guard with their plates in their hand, and they pick and choose from the foods available on the table, what nature has left for them at a given time, at a given place. Teeth are important. Right? They're the utensils that you have to eat with. But they aren't necessarily the most important element in the decision. They can limit what can be eaten, but food choice is determined largely by availability in a given habitat. What there is to eat, what your choices are. This is why chimpanzees eat soft forest foods, whereas gelada baboons on the open savanna consume tough grass blades and seeds? It's not because their teeth tell them to. It's because that's what there is. Okay, well, if that's the case, how can teeth teach us anything about diet in real life? That's where another category of evidence comes in, category I call food prints, which are kind of like footprints on the sand. They're traces of actual behavior of living animals. They're not sort of adaptive lines of evidence, and they're not subject to sort of this adaptationist assumption. They tell you what a specific animal, alive in the past, ate at a given moment in time. And the food print that I look to most often, and some people look at others like isotopes, the one I look to is dental microwear, the microscopic scratches and pits that form on a tooth's surface as the result of its use. So this capuchin monkey at the top here crushes hard nuts all the time, and that creates pits on the surface of the tooth. This howling monkey shears tough leaves. Think of a pair of scissors with the abrasives in those leaves getting dragged along the blades as the scissors open and close, creating long parallel scratches. We should be able to use this to say something about diet. The conventional way of doing this is you take a scanning electron microscope, you stick your tooth under it, and then you go in there and you count and you measure all of the scratches and pits on each of the teeth that you are interested in studying, sometimes hundreds and hundreds of them. In this case, almost 500 features. And that's why I'm wearing these bloody glasses. But anyway, it is tedious, but in the end, it can give you important information. On this graph, we have the bars being different species with different dietary adaptations, or dietary behaviors, I should say. In gold, hard object feeders. In green, leaf eaters. In red, soft fruit eaters. On the y-axis, we've got the ratio of pits to scratches. A lot of pits, higher values. A lot of scratches, lower values. And as you can see, the leaf and the hard object feeders are clearly separated with the fruit eaters in the middle. And we should be able to put fossils on this graph and say something about their diets. Now that's all well and good, but just like the dental topography studies, conventional dental microair has its limitations. First of all, we have that 3D to 2D problem, right? When you take an SEM image, it's two-dimensional, and you're reducing a three-dimensional surface to 2 dimensions, meaning there's information loss. The information you lose depends on the settings. So, for example, in this case, the topography, the relief, is really a story told by the shading, the shadowing on the surface. Think of sitting at the edge of the Grand Canyon at sunrise, midday, and sunset. You see a very different looking canyon at different times because the light source is in a different angle. And it's the same with an SEM. So I can give you pretty much any picture you want to see for the same image just by rotating the electron beam in the collector, scratchy or pitty or whatever. We try to set the instrument the same way, but this is clearly a source of noise. Of course, the other source of noise is with this many features, the measurements are never very repeatable. Two people are never going to get the same number twice. Typically, even, I did this for years and years and years, and the best I got was about 4% variance between, with multiple measurements of the same surface. So another source of noise. So I set out to solve these two problems as well and develop something called dental topographic or dental microair texture analysis with some colleagues. We start with a confocal profiler, create a three-dimensional surface to solve the 3 to 2 dimension problem, and then used an engineering standard called scale-sensitive fractal analysis to come up with a quantitative characterization that was free of observer measurement error. What is scale-sensitive fractal analysis? Well, some of you may be interested in this for your own research. It's based on the idea that surface texture depends on the scale of observation. So let's say you're driving on a backcountry road somewhere in rural Idaho. to you sitting in the car, that road may appear smooth, but to an ant crossing that road, it could appear very, very rough. And the important element of the Microair signal seems to come in bridging those scales. So, for example, if you lay tiles on top of a Microair surface, coarse tiles and then finer tiles and then even finer tiles, as you get into the nooks and crannies, the roughness of the surface increases with your scale of observation. Just how fast that roughness increases, the steepest part of the slope is called complexity. And a highly pitted surface with features of various shapes and sizes will be much more complex than a surface with uniform scratches. There are lots of other measurements that we take in dental Microair texture analysis. Without going into details on how they work, here's just one example. This is anisotropy, or directionality of the surface. This surface with lots of oriented scratches has higher anisotropy than this surface without those oriented scratches or with pits. And we can actually characterize Microair surfaces this way, such that a leaf-eating howling monkey has more uniform Microair surfaces, more simpler ones that are anisotropic, whereas the hard object feeding South American monkey, the capuchin, has more complex anisotropic surfaces. Same holds for the grass-eating gelada baboon of Africa, or our sooty mangabe, hard object specialist. In fact, this pattern separating Microair textures doesn't just work for primates. It holds across all the mammals we've looked at so far. Compare this flesh-feeding cheetah with this bone-crunching hyena, this tough bamboo-eating panda with a more omnivorous black bear, this browsing kangaroo with this, or grazing kangaroo with this browsing wallaby, even a leaf-eating sloth that doesn't even have enamel on its teeth with a more omnivorous armadillo. The texture complexity and anisotropy tell the story regardless. My favorite example are the antelopes. If we plot anisotropy versus complexity for antelopes that range along a spectrum from those that eat nothing but grass to those that eat nothing but tree products, fruit and other browse, we see a beautiful separation between the two. The reason this is important for paleoanthropology is that we can use this to reconstruct the environment. So let's say that we find a bunch of antelopes in the same deposit as a fossil human ancestor, and they all have a grazing Microair signature. That tells us that this human ancestor probably lived in a savanna, in a more open setting, because, well, you eat grass, there's got to be grass there. If most of the antelopes are browsers or frugivores, it was probably a more closed setting. So we use this for paleoenvironmental reconstruction. But let's get back to this, the primates, just for a moment. Our hypothesis is that tough food specialists should be clustered down in the simple and isotropic end of the spectrum. Hard object specialists should be clustered up in the more complex area, and hard object fallback feeders, like our mangabes from Thai that only occasionally take hard foods, should have mostly simple surfaces, but a few out towards that hard extreme. So even though the teeth of these two species may look the same, the Microair signature shouldn't be. And in fact, that's exactly what we find. Here we have a tough leaf feeder, that silvery langur that I showed you early on in the talk. Here is that hard object specialist, mangabe from Thai. Here's a soft fruit-eating macaque monkey. And as you can see, the average Microair texture complexity reflects the differences in diet. Most interesting is this guy, our hard object fallback feeder. They look very much like the soft fruit eater, and most of the time they eat soft fruits. But they have these outliers, presumably reflecting the occasional hard object consumption. So we're getting exactly what we expect. All right, with that in mind, let's shift gears and talk about what this can teach us about our own ancestors. In order to do that, I understand that this is not an anthropology colloquium, so let me give you a 2-minute or even a 1-minute quick synopsis of human evolution. Now, despite what many folks here in Arkansas might tell you, the human fossil record is loaded with an embarrassment of riches. There are literally thousands of fossils that have been found and identified as fossil hominins, members of the subtribe actually, technically, to which humans belong. These span about 7 million years and can be thought of in 4 basic categories. A group that we call Ardipithecus and friends from about 7 to about 4.5 million years ago. These are putative hominins. There's a lot of debate as to what side of the split between humans and chimps they came on, because they pretty much straddled the time of the split, at least based on our genetic information. But they lived in what was then the woodlands of Eastern and Central Africa, and were still pretty much confined to the trees. By about 4 million years ago, we get the second group, Australopithecus, from about 4 to 2 million years ago. These hominins start to show evidence of coming down out of the trees, which makes sense because the savannas are beginning to spread across Africa. And then around 2.5 million years ago, maybe 2.8, there's a split in the evolutionary tree with 2 more groups. First, some evolutionary cousins called Paranthropus, which are these extremely specialized forms with honking big muscle attachment sites and massive teeth. And then our own biological genus Homo. And we all know the story of Homo. Smaller teeth, bigger brains. When we focus on the teeth, what we see with Ardipithecus is a creature with a fairly moderate-sized molar teeth with thin enamel and reasonable crests, pretty much what you'd expect of a soft fruit eater living in the forest. But when we get to Australopithecus, and particularly Paranthropus, the teeth get bigger, flatter, the enamel gets thicker. They seem to be becoming more specialized. On the other hand, when we get to Homo, there is a reversal of the trend. Compared to Australopithecus, the teeth get smaller, the enamel gets thinner, the crests get sharper. So this leads us to a basic scenario, a basic model, where we start with a soft fruit-eating forest ape like Ardipithecus, and go to early and later Australopithecus and into Paranthropus. We get progressive specialization for savanna foods like tough grasses and hard tubers. But Homo reverses the trend. As the teeth get smaller and the brains get larger, we start to see cut-marked bones and stone tools. And the idea is that meat and other foods become incorporated into the diet, and we start to get a more generalized adaptation. That's the sort of conventional story. How does it hold up? Well, let's go back to gentle topographic analysis. Here is just occlusal slope. This is the same graph I showed you before, but with only gorillas and chimps at the 3 different wear stages. When we put Australopithecus on, we see that Australopithecus had flatter teeth than chimpanzees, suggesting less ability to shear or slice foods, but more ability to crush hard ones. Paranthropus has even flatter teeth, suggesting more specialization for hard foods and less for tough ones. Interestingly, early Homo comes out in between chimps and gorillas, suggesting based on the crestiness of the teeth, early Homo was capable of consuming more hard foods than, or efficiently breaking down more hard foods than chimps. Tough foods than chimps, but more hard foods than gorillas. So this result seems to hold pretty well with what the classic analyses have suggested. But is it really that simple? Let's go back to the biospheric buffet table for a moment. Let's look at the food prints, the Microair. And I've done Microair analyses on several species of early hominins to date. Here's a list of the cast of characters. We've got Three different types here: Australopithecus in red, Paranthropus in blue, Homo in green. And when we go one by one, we can see that Australopithecus doesn't have a lot of evidence for hard object feeding based on microair complexity. Maybe the South African form, which is a little later than the East African afarensis, has a little bit more hard food in its diet, but not much to write home about. Much more interesting is Paranthropus. Two species, one in the east, one in the south. The one in the east looks just like its Australopithecus ancestors. No hard foods. But the one in the south looks completely different, with a much broader diet, including many more hard objects. Finally, when we go to Homo, we see a fairly broad diet compared to their Australopithecus ancestors. Early Homo having a slightly broader diet than Australopithecus before it, and the later Homo species an even broader diet. So, okay, just to break this down very quickly, this leads to a scenario where we have increasingly broad diets from early to late Australopithecus and then early to later Homo. And the same pattern with Paranthropus, early to later Australopithecus and into Paranthropus, at least for the South African species. But the East African species, which has similar teeth and jaws, has a very different diet, at least based on the microair, much narrower. So the kind of difference we see here is probably akin to what we're seeing with the two closely related mangabees. The shapes of teeth alone cannot necessarily tell you what an animal is eating on a day-to-day basis. And this brings us back to the biospheric buffet. Fortunately, we know something of this buffet table during the course of human evolution because paleoclimatologists have given us a very nice picture of the environment in Africa during the course of human evolution. It has vacillated or fluctuated or oscillated from warm and wet to cool and dry. And it's become progressively cooler and drier over time, which makes sense given the spread of the savannas across the continent. But more than that, the amplitude of fluctuation has increased over time. And many people, including me, have argued that what you're seeing with a broadening diet in Homo is a response to the increasing amplitude of variation, the uncertainty that comes from that buffet table changing over more and more across time. And it's an adaptation for versatility in diet, driven by climate change. So this is about what we know, really, about the evolution of human diet. Let me take the last couple of minutes to talk a little bit about some of the implications of this. Over the past couple of decades, the paleo diet has been incredibly popular, to the point where Matthew McConaughey and Miley Cyrus and lots of other people have been Paleolithic diet aficionados. These books have sold millions and millions of copies, based on the fundamental idea that many of the health problems that we face today, chronic degenerative diseases, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, several forms of cancer, are related to the fact that we're not eating what our bodies evolved to eat. There's a mismatch. So just like you wouldn't put diesel in a car built for regular gasoline, you shouldn't eat foods that your body's not designed to eat. Whether you're filling your tank or stuffing your face, the wrong fuel can wreak havoc on the system. What should we eat? Well, according to the diet gurus, it's not cereal grains, dairy, or highly processed or refined foods. We should get our carbohydrates from starchy vegetables like this, like asparagus and stuff. We should get our protein from grass-fed cows and fish. And you know, the reality is I'm not a dietitian, and I can't speak with any authority about the nutritional costs and benefits of either of these diet types. But, you know, I can speak to the evolutionary underpinnings of this whole idea. When people ask me what the early hominin diet was, what the ancestral human diet was, I can't answer it because there are is no ancestral human diet, right? Our lineage was a work in progress. Different species ate different kinds of foods. And not just that, we know that one species, say Homo erectus, living in the savannah, probably ate different foods from Homo erectus living by the lakeshore or living on the riverbank, because it's all about the biospheric buffet. And if anything, it seems that sort of an adaptation for a versatile broad diet may be part of what makes us human. Perhaps this is why we've managed to find something to eat everywhere we have moved on the planet. Whether we're living up on the north slope of Alaska, getting nearly everything we eat from marine mammals and fish, or living down by the equator, getting 70% of our calories from sugary melons and starchy roots, it seems to me that this adaptation for versatility, given and driven by environmental change, may be sort of what the real sort of important story of ancestral diets are. And it's a story that I think teeth play an important role in. So that's pretty much all I have to say. I want to thank John Zeiker and the Department of Biological Sciences at Boise State for the kind invitation for me to present to you, and all of these other folks as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, very much. That was a fascinating and very engaging talk. I wonder if we have a few minutes for questions. I think we do. If anybody has any questions, you can either put them in the chat or raise your hands using the if you click on participants, there's a raise hand function. And I'd say I'm no longer host, so Peter, you might have to field questions if we have any.
Well, not much so far. It's kind of hard with...
Hi. I'll give it a shot. Hi. Sorry, it took me a while to get my stuff off. Thank you, Peter. That was great. I wanted to first just point out, I think I love the example that you gave of translating or transferring techniques from another field like geoscience and topography to another one. So that was really cool to get to see that sort of integration of techniques into another field. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, absolutely.
All right. So my question for you is, I have a couple, but I'm going to start with how much can we rely on teeth when so much of our ability to adapt to food is past that in our guts, those being more sort of dynamic and flexible to deal with a greater sort of variety of things. And one example is, birds that don't have those teeth and therefore relying on a completely different morphological structure to sort of dictate this diet versus environment sort of evolution. So,
well, the problem is we don't have guts in the fossil record, by and large. I mean, there are a couple of exceptions. Some of the lignite materials from Europe have specimens that have preserved guts, but by and large, teeth are all we have to deal with. They're only part of the story, clearly. Guts are an important part of the story. Ironically, our guts do not make for very good broad diets. We've got the guts of carnivores. We're not designed, our teeth are herbivorous, or actually omnivorous, but our guts are carnivorous. We've got small, short guts, and the argument there is that this is sort of a way to balance our energy to compensate for the big brain that we have. The brain is such an expensive tissue that we can't afford a big gut. But yeah, as far as guts go, they're clearly important. Some creatures, some primates especially, are essentially cows. Others are essentially horses that have large multisaturated stomachs or large ceca, hindguts, but this is something that we really can't get at with the fossil record. Another issue, of course, is tools. That's something that's unique and distinctive. Well, actually, it's not unique and distinctive to humans. Most other animals that use tools and those that make tools use them for processing food or acquiring food, whether you're a chimpanzee or a crow. But tools are very important as well to the story. And I consider fire, for example, one of those tools, right? Because it detoxifies, it facilitates digestion. And so these are also important elements to consider. But the topic of this talk was teeth, and that's sort of mostly what we got in the fossil record.
I guess that was more based on teeth.
Sorry, you're kind of broken up.
If these other morphological explain why. Oh, sorry. That's all right. Go on to somebody else. I have bad internet here.
Okay.
Go ahead and go on to somebody else. Thank you.
Sure. There are a couple of questions in the chat box. When you were talking about using dental microair and fossils to reconstruct ancient environments, how would natural wear or exposure to the elements complicate microair analysis? That is a wonderful question. We're talking about something called taphonomic bias or taphonomic disturbance of those fossils. When an animal is left out on the savanna to rot for decades, those teeth can, or when it's buried and moved around, those teeth can be damaged, right? And we have very specific criteria for including and excluding teeth in analyses. So there are certain parts of the teeth called facets where the uppers and lowers come together. And you can see the patterns of wear on those facets. If you have pits or scratches on the part of a tooth that is not used for chewing, say the sides of the tooth, we exclude them from analysis. So that's our basic way of telling whether the tooth has exposure to the elements complicating microair. And if there's anything off of the chewing surfaces, we exclude it for fear that there was something after death that caused that pattern that you see. I hope that answers your question, Brady. Increased ash or dust can result in greater microair compared to without these abrasive materials on foods. That's a good question. And it's an important question that a lot of people are worrying about today. What is the impact of dietary abrasives on tooth wear, and especially microair? If you eat the same foods, but you eat in a grittier environment, does that change the pattern of microair? Well, it certainly changes the pattern of gross wear, because we know that people living in a desert wear their teeth much more rapidly than people living, say, in a rainforest that is pretty much sheltered from dust and erosion. But because microair is caused by the interactions of teeth and the way that they come together, you're going to get pits or scratches depending upon not the type of abrasive, but the interactions of the teeth with one another. And basically what happens is microair turns over. It lasts just a couple of weeks on the surface of a tooth. Basically what you're doing is you're loading up a tooth with wear, and as you wear it down, you get more and more scratches replacing the older scratches. And so basically, whether your pattern accumulates over a short period of time, because your diet is very abrasive, or a very long period of time, because your diet is less abrasive, the pattern should be the same if the diet is the same. Hope that answers the question. All right, next, what are the differences we can tell about in the diet of other human species, such as Neanderthals and Denisovans? Neanderthals were more carnivorous. Is this true? Ha! Wonderful question. Denisovans, you got me. There just aren't enough of them right now to know much about them. I could fit every Denisovan tooth that's been discovered in one hand, and nobody's done microair on them. On the other hand, There's a lot of Microair work done on Neanderthals. I've done it. But I think what we learn mostly about Neanderthal diet comes from another kind of food print called isotope analyses. And if you look at the types of nitrogen that are present in the teeth of Neanderthals, they suggest higher trophic level and, yes, the consumption of more animal prey than modern humans that lived around the same time in Europe. So there are food prints, and they tend to indicate that Neanderthals may have consumed more animal protein, animal foods, than anatomically modern humans. That doesn't mean they didn't consume plants. They clearly did, because we also have parts of plants. We've got plant remains embedded in the tartar of Neanderthal teeth. Between the tooth and the tartar, when you scrape that off, you can see there are telltale starch granules, suggesting that they had the wild ancestors of barley, for example, in their diets. So it's too simple to say that Neanderthals were carnivores. They were omnivores, but it looks like that on average they did consume more meat than we do today. Okay, what was the first example you gave for the default model of species-specific dietary adaptations in primates? Well, basically, there's a gentleman by the name of Robert Sussman, Bob Sussman. He spent most of his career at WashU, who came up with the species-specific dietary adaptations model. He went to Madagascar in the 1970s, believe it or not, and studied 2 species of lemur, one that ate more leaves, one that ate more fruit. He went to 3 different sites. At one site, there was only one of the species. At another site, there was the other species. And at the third site, they were both species. And it turns out that at all of the sites, at the 2 sites where each species was located, they ate the same foods, whether or not they interacted with the other primate. So his argument was that whether or not, if you eat leaves, it doesn't matter whether you come into contact with a fruit eater or not. You're going to prefer leaves. And he found a similar phenomenon studying macaque monkeys that sailors had brought to some of the islands in the Indian Ocean. Macaque monkeys are endemic to Southeast Asia, and he found macaque monkeys actually in these little islands that had been brought there inadvertently or intentionally, and he found that whether those macaque monkeys were at home in Southeast Asia or in these little islands, they did tend to find the same kinds of foods when clearly the same species of foods were not available. And so that was the basis for the default model for species-specific dietary adaptations. And in fact, a lot of paleontologists who looked to teeth to reconstruct diet breathed a huge sigh of relief, because it suggested that animals with given teeth were destined to eat specific kinds of foods. Turns out that may not be quite, the story is not quite that simple, though.
Great. Well, thank you again very much, Peter. That was an excellent talk, and appreciate the answers to the questions. And so we're going to take about a 10-minute break and get together again with the EEB 601 class. So thanks, everybody, for coming, and I hope you enjoyed today's talk.
Thank you so much.